very complicated role you're giving this person. They both have to attend Commission meetings and Council meetings. The Commission mandate is to take no notice of heads of government, but to be a corporate, sort of cabinet structure of responsibility being shared. It will be a very difficult task. And I actually think it's too big a role for any single person. If you also want, as we do with Solana, to be chosen on merit, to be our representative on the quartet in the Middle East, and to be the negotiator for America, as well as France and Britain and Germany, and indirectly the EU, with Iran. These detailed negotiations things are not coming to Solano automatically. They're coming because people have got confidence in him. And it takes a hell of a long time, as I know it in my class. So I think that actually both proposals are flawed. I can live with, personally, the attempt to double hat. Let's hope it works. I'm worried about it. I think it has not been thought through. I don't believe they've thought through this European diplomatic service. I don't think the Commission have understood that the new role we've fortunately and very importantly dropped the title of foreign minister, but a lot of governments will deliberately call it, whoever holds that post, foreign minister. And one of my real worry about all this is it's the besetting sin of the European Union is pretension. And pretension and pretense are two words that are quite close together, but they're different. But when they act together, they are very dangerous. Now, as I say all this as a convinced European. I'm not a Eurosceptic. I want a European foreign policy where there's genuine agreement. I want machinery to try and create a climate in which you can build enough confidence. And I can live with most of the changes that have been made. But the fundamental I will not cross is that foreign policy is intergovernmental. It is not subject to qualified majority voting. If there is a substantive disagreement in a member state, that has to be respected. Let me give you an example. We are still arguing about the name of the former former Yugoslavian Republic of Macedonia. Nobody calls it that, they call it Macedonia, but its formal name in NATO and in the UN is Fyrom. The Greeks could never live with it. A Greek government fell on this issue. There was a crowds of, I think, 500,000 Thessalonica protesting at it at one stage in 92, 93. These are sort of really raw issues. And I kept on having to persuade foreign ministers that it was quite ludicrous to argue that this should go to a qualified majority vote. The Greeks could not live with it. It was politically impossible for them to live with it. And that we had to take time and gradually hope. And Vance and I, and then Stoltenberg and I, and since then it's been largely taken over by an American envoy, have spent hours and hours trying to find a wording that could be acceptable in Skopje and in Athens. Now, I could have cited many other examples for that. Take an example which has got very little British connection to it. If you are in a consensus organisation, you do not establish consensus by a majority vote. That is an illusion. We have already pared it down. We've allowed people to come out against a policy, but not to use their vote. They don't have to vote. And the Greeks actually used that very creatively for the European Union when it came to the battle and NATO's decision over Kosovo. They totally opposed to it. They just never voted for it. They didn't block it. They did allow reinforcements to come in from Thessalonica up through Macedonia into Kosovo. And they played a role fully as a member of NATO and in the EU, and they were not obstructive even though they disagreed with the policy. Now that's their decision not to be obstructive. But if they go to the full, and Cyprus look like doing much the same thing over Kosovo recognition in South European Union. But if the issue is so strong that they can't live with it, then they must be allowed to veto it if it's a consensual organisation. And this is what you've got to start facing. Those of you who may want to have majority voting in foreign policy, just start to realise it soon ceases to be intergovernmental, and it effectively becomes a European Union foreign policy. Well, if you want that, that's fine. I'm almost too old to want to argue about it. But if you do, this European Union that you will be a member of in 20 years' time will be a very, very different organisation to that which the British people gave their politicians the authority to join. And this is where I'm arguing about limits. It's not an easy subject, and it's very difficult to define. If you set the limits in concrete, you can't make any progress. That's obviously unfortunate. So how do you have limits? Well, obviously the main limit is your own democratic parliament. And here we come to the nub of the problem. And this was always accepted. It was what Enoch Howe made his very strong and passionate speeches on, Michael Foot, in 1971 and 72. That we proceed in the European Union through treaties. And treaties are signed by governments and ratified by parliaments and ratified as a whole. It's either all or nothing. Take it or leave it. You can't make amendments to it. That is a very difficult, and was always a very difficult thing for Westminster to swallow. We don't have a written constitution. We have a much tougher stringency procedure through our process of legislation than most other European parliaments. Not all by any means. The Danish is pretty tough and pretty strong. And so that was, we had to accept it. But as we go now more and more into these sensitive areas, where people are saying, okay, go as far as you can on foreign policy, but remain intergovernmental, you've got to look at the wording of these treaties very carefully. And this is the problem. The All-Party Foreign Affairs Committee has drawn attention to the fact that in the part of the Lisbon Treaty which deals with European security and defence policy, there is about a common European, a single European defence. There is, one word says will, and the other says might. Now, in the English language, there's a hell of a difference between will and might. We can't do anything about it. I mean, we have to define what it means, either will or might. I saw some government spokesman, I hope not Foreign Secretary, said there's no difference. We all know what we mean. Well, we don't. And I think it's extremely important that this sort of issue starts to be grappled with. Now, we get round it by ministers coming to Parliament and giving an interpretation of the words. But that's been going on for so many years now. We know that that process is flawed. When the employment legislation aspects of the social contract, social chapter were being discussed, Parliament was given solemn assurances by ministers and Lord Advocates and Solicitor Generals and Attorney Generals and everything like that, that there was nothing in these words which would have any impact whatever on British legislation. Hey presto, the Commission introduced the concept of health and safety and began to change employment legislation through the health and safety area, which had been agreed by common consent, could be unqualified majority voting. So an area which you had thought was subject to the veto was got round. The British appealed, it went to the European Court of Justice, surprise, surprise, the European Court of Justice, which is every single decision it's ever made, has been in the federalist direction, and sees its role as pushing Europe towards ever greater unity,